What's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in to Rethinking Christianity. Today, we talk with Josh Mcnall all about this book that he has coming out titled Perhaps. And this book is all about living in the space between doubt and dogmatism. So, certainty and uncertainty. And living in this space of perhaps can be really beneficial and helpful for people that are on their journey of faith that deal with both sides of the spectrum. And I think that this book is going to be really helpful for a lot of people, just as this conversation was really helpful for me, and I hope that it will be for you also. If you could do me a huge favor by subscribing on here on YouTube, that would be super appreciated. Or if you would like to share this with someone that you think would find it helpful, that would be really, really appreciated. And with all that being said, here is the interview with Josh on his book titled Perhaps. Josh, thank you for coming on Rethinking Christianity. Josh is a professor of pastoral theology at Oklahoma Wesleyan University. He's the host of the podcast Outpost Theology and the author of several books. He has a new release coming out September 21st titled Perhaps, Reclaiming the Space Between Doubt and Dogmatism. So I'm excited to have Josh on today as we kind of discuss his book. And I think this book is something that can be helpful for a lot of people as they're dealing with the tension between certainty and dogmatism and doubt. And so, Josh, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So before we kind of dive into some of the stuff that you talk about in the book, I'd love to just hear a little bit about you and how you ended up in the studies of theology and as a professor, because that's a route that is kind of rare for a lot of people. And it's I just would love to hear about it.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Kansas, so there are real people living in Kansas in the middle of the country. I was one of them, kind of out in the country. My dad was a pastor, kind of a small country church there. And so I grew up in the church but, I wrestled with probably just like everybody does. What's my path in life? What's my calling? And I did feel called to some form of ministry, but I didn't really feel called to be a pastor full time, and so I was drawn to thinking and kind of analyzing and studying. Big reader, I guess. I'm a nerd, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
And so I always kind of felt like I was going to be a professor, and studied pastoral ministry in undergrad, but felt more drawn to academia. And then so I went on to do a degree in theology in the Boston area for my master's, and then a PhD over in England at the University of Manchester for my my doctorate. But I've been wrestling with questions of faith and God and meaning, kind of all along the way. But my heart is really for folks who, in some ways, maybe are on the edge of the church, and they increasingly have questions about God, about how the Bible speaks to their life, and so this book is really, in some ways, for those folks. It's lightly academic. I mean, there are footnotes, but it's not like
Yeah.
it's not designed to be super, super dense reading. It's for folks who feel kind of caught between those extremes of a kind of maybe crippling secular doubt or agnosticism, and then on the other side, increasingly sort of narrow or angry religious dogmatism or fundamentalism. And so that's really who it's for.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely feel like this book is necessary and something that can be useful on both sides of the spectrum. Because I think a lot of times it's easy, I think, to get, at least from my experience, caught up on just focusing on the specifics of doubt. Whereas dogmatism can also be as kind of damaging, or maybe not as healthy of a way to practice faith. And so I think that I haven't read a book where it's been like dealing with both of them. It's been mostly dealing with doubt. And so I really appreciate that in this. So this book is titled Perhaps, and I really like the language that you use there to kind of describe this tension. And I read a quote that you mentioned by N.T. Wright, and it says, "To believe in providence often means saying perhaps." And is that kind of where some of the ideas from the book kind of derive from? And what kind of led you to just writing this book? I know you mentioned your heart for those people, but what were kind of the thoughts that kind of led into writing it?
Yeah, that quote was one of the early things that I read that first made me first kind of birth this idea or this project in my mind. And that word, I think, is interesting because it's in some ways it's kind of a cautious or a humble word because you're not saying, "Look, I have all the answers. I'm 100% certain." You're kind of saying, "Well, maybe, you know, maybe this is how it works." And so there's a little bit of intellectual humility in it, but at the same time, it's in some ways a bold word if we're talking about theology because we're not just sitting there content with our questions or our lack of understanding. We're actually reaching out for something and trying to wrap ideas and words around things that we can't quite grasp. And so it's interesting both for its kind of humility, but also there's a sense of creative boldness or imagination that goes along with saying that word. And so that's that quote from Wright. Sometimes believing in providence, or your listeners might know, sometimes clinging to faith in God means learning how to say perhaps,
Yes.
especially if you feel like you're kind of falling off the map of faith. Then that little word can be sort of like a stepping stone that you can use to sort of hold on to something as you're searching for answers.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's yeah, I like that word, and what you mentioned about the kind of the humility of it is very necessary. Because what I have found and I've had to work on this in my own kind of walk of faith is dealing with this idea that there are parts of faith that are just like mystery. There's a mystery
Mhm.
to faith, and I found that that is a good thing rather than leaning more or less on to one side of the spectrum than another. And I read one of your blog posts and I saw the graphic of like it
Mhm.
had dogmatism on one side and then it had doubt on the other, and it had this the perhaps in the middle. And I thought that visual was really helpful for myself. Do you have kind of a way in which, you know, we have these two ends of the spectrum that I think a lot
Mhm.
of people deal with, and some people, I think, you know, different personalities just naturally lean towards one or the other. Do you have kind of, you know, working definitions as to how you would personally, I guess, define dogmatism and how you would define doubt? Because I think that could be
Yeah.
helpful and maybe clarifying in that.
Yeah, I think defining what I mean by those is super important, and sometimes we don't do that very well. So we'll start with dogmatism, kind of that one extreme. And I define dogmatism. It's really not like Christians sometimes talk about the central dogmas of the faith, and that might be like, Jesus is the Son of God or the Trinity or something. So I'm not really talking about it in those terms. Dogmatism for me is a matter of tone, like how we speak, and
Yeah.
then emphasis. And so, in terms of tone, what I mean by dogmatism is when we take on this really sort of shrill, aggressive, kind of angry, arrogant tone. And we see that all the time in the culture wars, left versus right,
Yeah.
things like that. So, by dogmatism, I'm talking about the tone or the posture that we take towards other people, especially when they might disagree with us. And then secondly, it's a matter of emphasis. And so what I mean by that is dogmatism often adopts a posture of false certainty, claiming to have certainty on issues that maybe we ought to hold a little bit more loosely and with a little bit more humility. And so it's false certitude, and it's this tone of kind of shrillness or anger that we often adopt in a culture that's sort of divided and polarized.
Yeah, and I think that the what you mentioned there is definitely, you know, as from personal experience with others and with myself, I found that the last thing that is helpful to a person that is on the fringe, that's kind of working through those things, is that like divisive, that certitude. Almost, there's oftentimes, and I have this, I guess it's a maybe a pride thing, but there's part of me sometimes is like, man, I don't want to believe in what you believe, even if you are right, because of how
Mhm,
confident you are about it and how much you swear you're right. And so
mhm.
that's something that I've definitely struggled with in that kind of area.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes I think we try to convince ourselves, there's an old preacher story, I don't know if it's true or not, of the preacher who wrote in the margin of his sermon notes, "Point is weak, comma, yell louder." And so it's like he knows that his point's not that great, it's not airtight, and so the attempt is to just shout louder to make up for that lack of sort of robust thought. And I think sometimes we do that because we're insecure and we know that maybe this thing that we're claiming to believe or that we're saying doesn't hold water. And so we use volume, typing in all caps to try to make up for a lack of certainty in our own life. And so that's the dogmatism piece, the kind
Yeah.
of tone of shrillness and a posture of false certainty. But like you said, it's also important to define what I mean by this opposite
Yeah.
extreme of a kind of crippling doubt. And I don't think doubt is always negative. I think in some cases we're ambushed by uncertainty. I don't know how you could not struggle with doubt over the goodness of God or the holiness of God after a personal tragedy,
Yeah.
after something like the Holocaust on a grand scale or, the drowning of a toddler in a backyard pool. I mean, how could you not wrestle with doubt? And doubt can actually, in some cases, be helpful in our walk with God because I think God uses those wilderness experiences to refine us and to bring us maybe from a place of naivety where we just accept whatever we heard, in Sunday school or from our parents to a place of maturity. And so I'm not saying that all doubt is bad, and I'm certainly not saying that doubt is always avoidable.
Yeah.
But there is this thing in the scriptures where we frequently see the biblical writers speaking about how God works against our doubts, and Jesus calling people not to doubt, but rather to exercise faith or belief. And one of the things I try to do in the book is say, well, okay, well, what does the Bible mean by doubt?
Yeah.
Because if doubt's not always a bad thing, and if it's not always avoidable, why do the scriptures sort of speak against it, or why does Jesus sort of work against it to bring people to a place of trust rather than a place of certainty or skepticism? And so I spent some time kind of unpacking what the Bible means by doubt, because I think there's been some misconceptions. On the one hand, in the church, you have this sense where faith is construed as certainty.
Mm.
And so we're constantly seeking certainty because we think if that's what faith is, and if we want to get our prayers answered, or if we want to have a blessed life, then we have to remove all doubts from our minds, or, God's not going to heal us, or there's this kind of like prosperity gospel type view of faith that means that it's got to be a complete certitude, or like God's not going to work in your life. And I think that's really wrong. I don't think that's what the Bible means by doubt. So one of the things I deal with in getting into the scriptures is that in many cases, the scriptures speak of doubt not as a presence of questions or as a lack of certainty, but rather as divided allegiances within our hearts. They speak of doubt as like the divided soul, the person that's divided against themselves. And I think that's helpful because what it means is that we can be wrestling with questions and uncertainty and not be in a place of like sin or disobedience. Uh, what the scriptures mean oftentimes in terms of faith is an issue of allegiance and of trust, and not an issue of certainty or lack of questions. So that's just a little bit on the need to kind of define those two extremes so we don't get ourselves in a bad position.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that for people within that have grown up in church, because what I've seen a lot of is people that grow up in church and they kind of get hit with these things later on, maybe in their 20s, and maybe when they leave the setting that they've been growing up in, and it's almost like a shock factor. I feel like a lot
Yeah.
of people don't have like they don't know how to wrestle with it or respond to it, and so I see it like it's usually a response by either going towards dogmatism, where I've seen that, where I have friends that like just go straight to dogmatism, or they go to abandonment. Because I think that at least in some of my personal experiences, maybe the church or my personal experience in the church is not teaching people, well, what does it actually look like to work through doubt? And I think what you just mentioned about kind of clarifying those definitions is really helpful for people. And I think that is something that I think that, as we move forward, the church moves forward, I think can be really helpful for people that are wrestling with those things and dealing with those questions. And one of the things that is kind of interesting, you talk about an idea of speculation. And so speculation, and the way in which I've heard you refer to it, is in the regards of theology, like in academics, that
Mhm.
speculation, if you speculate, it's not necessarily a good thing.
Mhm.
But speculation, why do you think that this idea of speculation is just, when you naturally hear it, it's kind of this negative thing, when that may not necessarily be the case when someone is dealing with their faith?
Yeah, it's so there's kind of two parts to the book, or two focuses in the book. And one is the thing we talked about already, which is like this sense in this culture that we live in that's so divided between doubt and dogmatism, and how people feel pulled toward one of those two extremes. And then another aspect of the book, which you just mentioned, is that I'm dealing with, okay, well, what would be the purpose of imagination or speculation if we're going to try to avoid some of those extremes? And like you said, in theology, to call somebody's theology speculative is like never a compliment. It's always a shame word. And I list off a whole bunch of different theologians, from Karl Barth to Friedrich Schleiermacher to more recent theologians like Kevin Van Hooser and Scott Swain. And they all define speculation as a really, 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 really bad thing. But then they all define it in really different ways. So it has kind of a different definition for each person. The only thing they agree on is it's really bad.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I'm trying to do is say, well, okay, what if there's actually a beneficial purpose to speculating in certain cases? To say, what if, or perhaps, when we don't really have all the answers about a particular theological question, or a particular question about apologetics or about our faith, could there actually be a benefit to the use of the imagination to help us kind of keep functioning and keep thinking and keep living in an obedient fashion in spite of our lack of certainty? And
Yeah.
so I do think that there is a place for speculation in theology that doesn't necessarily result in you just coming up with all of these weird half-baked theories and asserting them as truth. And so that's the piece on speculation that I'm really kind of pushing back against the vast majority of theologians who are going to use that word in a negative way.
Yeah, I found that really interesting, because that is, you kind of like, when you hear that word in conversation, it is naturally just this negative word. He speculatively, kind of that negative tone, when it's used, it's never really even used in a positive tone. And so
Yeah.
I found that really interesting. So have you found like any of this stuff, like kind of in your own personal experience, kind of stuff that you've had to work through and walk through?
Yeah. Yeah, I have. I mean, and so at the end of the book, there's 3 chapters at the end that are kind of like case studies, where I'm just looking at a particular question that Christians wrestle with both today and in prior centuries. And so those 3 case studies, basically the first one begins in kind of primal history, even before humans even come on the scene. And it's a question that Charles Darwin had in his own walk, in his own faith. Here's a guy who admits in his letters that when he was aboard the Beagle, his famous voyage, that he thought the Bible was this unanswerable authority, and he actually got made fun of by the other people on the boat for being this like Bible thumper. And most of us don't think of like Charles Darwin as like a Bible thumper,
No.
but he talks about that, and he says one of the things that really like tipped him over the edge into agnosticism. He wasn't a full-fledged atheist, but he kind of let go of like a robust Christian faith. Was he said he had this question about, well, why would a loving, powerful, all powerful and all loving creator God design a world in such a way that it was the sufferings and the deaths of millions and millions of creatures over countless millennia before humans even came on the scene that actually propelled this world forward? And why would a loving God design it that way? And he basically answered, well, he wouldn't. So either God is not good, or he's not sovereign, or maybe he's not there at all.
Yeah.
But that question for him was a big kind of deal breaker for his Christian faith. And so I'm looking at in that chapter the question of animal suffering before humans even come onto the scene. And I don't come to some firm, again, like dogmatic conclusion,
Yeah.
but I'm just
Ironically.
laying out some, well, what if?
Yeah.
Maybe or perhaps this could be why this world functions in the way that it does. And one of the things I'm trying to do is I'm seeking what are called non-contrastive solutions, in which we don't just say either or in certain cases where we don't really know for sure, but we try to find a creative, maybe third option or a kind of way to bring together different options. So that's one that I've wrestled with as I've studied science, as I've studied the scriptures, as I've studied the world. And I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but when you talk about why people are deconstructing their faith and why they're having doubts, one of the number one things they'll mention, in addition to like partisan politics or sexual ethics, one of the big ones that they'll mention, maybe a third one, is questions from science. And how does science fit with the claims of Christianity? So that's just one of those last three chapters, but it examines a question that I've wrestled with, and lots of other Christians, including Darwin, wrestled with.
Yeah. And I appreciate that kind of like that thinking of like like just divisive thinking. And it's just it's one of those things that I've had to try and reconcile with, because that's a question that I still deal with and I still wrestle with. And I think it's one that listeners, when they hear this, that they will also kind of relate to, because it's clearly something that people struggle with if you're able to do case studies on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd love to talk about some. So you quote Dumbledore, which is a great quote. It's a really good quote, and I guess technically be J.K. Rowling. But
Yeah.
so this quote, I just want to talk about like the actual practice of working through doubt. So this quote says, "Curiosity is not a sin, but we should exercise curiosity with caution."
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think one ought to be cautious in their doubt and living in perhaps? So as they're living in this kind of perhaps mindset, why should they
Yeah.
be cautious? And then I have a follow-up question,
Sure.
as because I've talked about this with people and they have like an opposite viewpoint on this.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So is the opposite, just to kind of clarify the question, is the opposite viewpoint that curiosity is always bad? Like curiosity killed the
I
cat?
didn't even think about that. So yeah, so I guess that could be one side of it, but I've had people, when I've talked about deconstruction and doubt, they've viewed it from the perspective of deconstruction should be this freeing thing where they get to do this, and that there should be no. I think you used the language guardrails.
Yeah.
And there should be no guardrails around it, so that a
Yeah.
person can be truly honest with the fate that they come to the conclusion of. And
Yeah.
so, but like you just mentioned, yeah, on the flip side of that, I could see on the opposite side that the more dogmatic side, that
Mm-hmm.
caution is, or curiosity can be sinful. So,
Yeah. Well, you can kind of see my personality coming out, because like in each one of these issues
yeah,
that we've talked about, I'm always laying out, well, here's one extreme way over here,
yeah,
and here's another extreme way over here. And I'm
yeah,
kind of trying to land a little bit in the middle, which of course we know, the middle is not always right.
yeah,
If somebody says that 2 + 2 = 4 and somebody else says 2 + 2 = 6, I mean, the right answer would not be to just split the difference and say it's 5.
yeah,
So that's a danger in my own personality, that I'm always kind of looking for this middle ground.
yeah, yeah. That's
But I
how I
do
am.
think that in some cases it's helpful to let's just say curiosity or speculation, that idea within our Christian walk or in theology. Speculation can run amok in all sorts of different ways, where we're just interested in spinning off all sorts of what if scenarios, and it can lead to just absurdity. It can lead to us losing the forest for the trees, and like ignoring like the main clear things of the Christian faith, like love your neighbor as yourself, this sort of, in getting off on these weird speculative bunny trails. And so that's an example of where curiosity can run amok. And that's why we have sayings like, curiosity killed the cat, or
Yeah,
whatever, that it can turn into just this, what one author calls what ifery, where you just constantly what if, but you don't come to any conclusions. You don't get down to the important work of obedience or loving your neighbor. So that's a danger in curiosity. And sometimes I would say this, sometimes deconstruction comes from a really honest place of seeing inconsistencies in the church and hypocrisy and abuse. Um, and it needs to happen. It can be a necessary and obedient thing to deconstruct false or abusive, un-Jesus like structures,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Sometimes though we deconstruct with motives, and I would say since I think all of us are fallen in our own ways, our motives are often mixed.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we're deconstructing because we just want to do what we want to do. And we know that if we don't deconstruct the parts of the Bible that we don't like, we're going to feel guilty about doing whatever we want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we have like a dog in this fight sometimes. And if I don't want to be faithful to my wife, if I don't want to give sacrificially to the poor, if I don't want to change my attitudes towards people that are prejudiced or biased, like sometimes deconstruction is coming from a place of selfishness, or it's this where to be honest, I just kind of want to be God.
Yeah.
And so if I can kick him off the throne, or if I can just remove all the parts from the scriptures that don't fit my cultural biases, then it's just a whole lot easier for me. So that's another thing I would say about maybe the danger of speculation or curiosity or even deconstruction is we don't always do it with the purest, at least speaking for myself, I don't always do it with the purest of motives. And so that's an important sort of check on maybe those voices who would only use it in a positive way. I think they're reacting, like I said, to a really narrow form of dogmatism, but the opposite extreme, deconstruction as a destination,
Yeah.
I think it's no way to live your life. And one of the authors I quote in the book is saying that like trying to get a community together centered around, say, atheism is like starting a league of people who don't play golf.
Yeah.
Like, like you can't like start a league just based on what you don't do.
Yeah.
It lacks a sort of center. And so those are just some random thoughts on, yeah, I think curiosity, deconstruction, speculation, there can be positive aspects to them, but I wouldn't just give myself over to this wholesale endorsement of them.
Yeah, it's definitely a kind of a hot buzzword, especially right now. I feel like, and I've had seasons of both where I've deconstructed probably because I want to kind of want to do what I want to do at times, and then
Mm-hmm.
other times where I think that I'm sure some listeners can relate to this is that trying to rationalize ideas and thoughts and beliefs about the scriptures and theology, because like what we mentioned a minute ago, those hard questions are not easy to deal with or grapple with as being just humans who cannot at times. That there is this like perhaps or this kind of mystery that's going on that makes it really difficult. And so you're a professor, and so you deal with, I'm assuming, younger people, and I'm sure you have a mix. So how much have you seen, I guess, if you've had conversations with students, I guess with millennials and Gen Z, I guess, I don't know if Gen Zs, they'll probably start getting into college in the next couple of years. How much have you seen where like their doubt and maybe deconstruction is driven by maybe like partisanship, or that dogmatism of certain kind of evangelicals? And I think, to be fair, when I say that, I think that there is also on the far left side of the spectrum, there is the same dogmatism, and I'm seeing that more and more. And so I don't want to be unfair to just more conservative when I say, when I ask that question.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because there is a sense in which even a certain form of doubt can become its own dogmatism.
Yes.
Right? It's a very narrow, it's a kind of fundamentalism
Yes.
in its own way, very narrow, very insular, very kind kind of angry and arrogant. So you're right. There's like a dogmatism on the other side of the spectrum that is an issue in certain places more than others. But so when I talk to young people, I live in Oklahoma. It's one of the most conservative, reddest Bible Belt states in the country. Um, and so culture matters wherever you're at. Like I was just preaching in Portland recently. That's a different culture, right?
Oh yeah.
Just a little bit. And I did my doctorate over in Manchester, England, different culture, right?
Yeah.
But where I'm at in Oklahoma, a lot of the issues that my students and former students are talking about when it comes to doubt and deconstruction, it has a kind of common sort of framework. Or one of my persons I was talking to recently said is it's almost like there's a shared Google Doc of doubt and deconstruction.
Yeah. That's pretty accurate. Yeah.
Like shout out to AJ Swoboda because I'm stealing that from him. He
There you
he
go.
mentioned that the other day. But in the shared Google Doc of doubt and deconstruction basically goes like this. At least in my part of the country, it often starts with church hurt,
Yes.
an experience of pain, abuse in the church. Uh, Oftentimes a kind of dogmatism, abusive leadership structures, fundamentalist sort of um, cultures. And so in my part of the country, it often starts with church hurt and kind of seeing behind the curtain, the hypocrisy and the imperfections of the church. And sometimes we kind of dismiss that as a valid reason because we're like, I've heard people say things like this: you don't get mad when you go to the gym if you see fat people there. Like you ought to be happy that they're there. They're trying to get in shape. And so the church is not a museum for saints. It's a hospital for sinners. And you should expect there to be imperfect people there. Right. And
Yeah.
that's totally true. I totally believe that, uh, pe- Christians are people and we're fallen and we hurt each other and, you know, but one of the things that one of my former students said to me recently is like, I didn't expect the church to be perfect.
Yeah.
He's like, but I did expect it to be like not worse than the culture in certain areas. And then increasingly, especially the last year and a half, with all of the fighting and the bickering over everything from masks to vaccines to conspiracy theories to elections to, he's like, it was like my church was worse than like my local Starbucks in those regards. And so I don't know that that's always true. It might be unfair to say that, but for me, the thing that I'm hearing on the shared Google Doc, first off, is church hurt, hurt within the church that has kind of scarred people. And in many cases, that leads to questions that then are more philosophical or theological in nature about like the problem of evil. If God is good and powerful, why doesn't he do something, Um, and so then the other thing I would mention is that church hurt piece increasingly with my students is connected with the extent to which evangelicalism especially has become really, really captured by a kind of political partisanship. Um, and it's not that these students are saying that we should run completely in the opposite direction to whatever the other extreme. If you're on the right, then run all the way to the left, or if you're on the left. But they're just saying, well, we ought to be able to recognize the weaknesses within our own kind of political camp and not only talk about kind of the other side.
Yeah.
And so those are some common themes if we're going to work off of that kind of shared Google Doc. The church hurt, which leads then to other questions that are sometimes more philosophical or theological, political partisanship within the church. And then a big one that uh, lots of people notice is just questions over sexual ethics and what the Bible teaches over whether it's LGBTQ issues or any other number of issues. Those are kind of some of those common themes that are along the pathway of doubt and deconstruction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good example. What was his name? AJ? Is that what you said?
Yes,
Yeah,
AJ
yeah.
Swoboda.
Yeah,
And
dude,
I feel bad about promoting you know how it is when you have a book coming out, you got to promote your book. And it feels like something feels kind of gross about constantly
yeah.
posting about your own book. So I give a shout out to AJ. He wrote a book called After Doubt, how
Okay.
to how to
Cool.
question your faith without losing it. And it's actually a really good book, so that I'm not just here promoting mine. I'll give a shout out to him.
Yeah, there we go. No, that's a really good illustration for. Honestly, that's exactly how the conversations I've had that lines up. It is kind of like a trickle down almost, and it usually does start a lot with some kind of church hurt, or then leading into those philosophical questions because they find themselves at a place where they feel more comfortable, I guess, questioning because they don't feel like they're betraying, and
Mhm.
because it's like, well, I've been betrayed, so I'm gonna ask these questions. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic there. And I think the stuff you mentioned about division in our country and just the last year of craziness, I think is really
Mhm.
interesting because I find this idea, this perhaps idea. I feel like this is also, and I was going to see if you agree with this. This is also applicable to just how we go about hard conversation and how we go about living life with one another. This
Mhm.
kind of this love your neighbor, the what Jesus calls people to, of loving your neighbor. I
Mhm.
feel like should almost always be this posture of, at least in some cases, this posture of perhaps of not like I'm so certain that it
Mhm.
ruins my relationships with people.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think in some cases, I think, I'm not one of the things I'm trying to be careful with in the book, because that word perhaps, since it's the title, every time I say it now, I notice it, and it's almost like annoys me, you know?
Yeah.
My students look at me like, "Is this a subtle plug for your book, or is it?" Um, there are certain ways in which it's not a helpful word, in certain ways in which
Yeah.
we shouldn't just eternally sit on the fence and leave all
Yeah.
options
Yeah. Yeah.
open, you know? I think sometimes it's 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 this kind of rooted trust in the truth of certain things, like, let's say, the resurrection or the goodness of God, that allows us to continue to love our neighbor in ways and in spaces where it doesn't make any earthly sense,
Yeah.
you know?
For sure.
And so that's a case in which something that might seem irrational or even like lack certitude, like belief in the resurrection or the goodness, the holiness of God, I think can actually enable us to love in ways that don't make sense if we're just loosely holding all of our
Yeah.
beliefs without any commitment or cost.
Yeah, yeah. And for myself personally, I am at a place where I just am, I'm not on the middle ground by any means on everything. There are
Mhm.
some things where I probably am a little, I guess, dogmatic about, and there are some things where I have some doubt. And I think that's all people. And I definitely think that what you just mentioned, that's very, very important. That what we're not saying is that you just have to be in the middle ground all the time.
Yeah.
But I think that, at least what I've perceived is that this can be a very helpful way forward or an attitude towards some of these conversations and some of these things.
Mhm.
And I think it's one that can be helpful for the church as a whole, as we've kind of already talked about. But I wanted to ask, I have this question and one more. Do you feel like that there is any like specific direction that maybe the church can kind of move forward in, out of the kind of the stuff that we've been talking about, the tension that's going on right now, not just with doubt and dogmatism, but just the attitudes that we kind of see that come from one side or the other, that they're so kind of at each other's throats at times.
Yeah, I think one of the things that pastors and the church at large have to do is to make themselves and their community a place where it is okay to wrestle with questions in your faith. And there's a lot of ways to do that. One of them is to just be honest as a pastor, as a preacher, about your own wrestling match in faith. You can't come across as this person who's just always blissfully certain.
Yeah.
um, if you do that, people who are struggling and wrestling are going to leave, because that isn't that's just not their experience, you know. And secondly, we can't preach in ways where we exclude people who are wrestling and just assume that we're all, you know, that's one of the things that the seeker sensitive movement, for all of its maybe imperfections, that's one of the things it got right. Where it's like, don't assume that everybody you're preaching to here is this committed Christian who, and so I think that's one thing we can do, is to make our churches, both in our, our groups, our sermons, our everything, a place where people can be honest about their questions instead of having to be fake and sort of pretend that they're all certain and happy and all that. A second thing we've already mentioned, though, is I think there has to be a decoupling of kingdom and party when
Yeah.
it comes to partisan politics. And that doesn't mean that you can't hold political opinions because you think that a particular platform or particular philosophy is better for people. I mean, you should hold opinions that you think are better for the community at large, and you should vote your conscience and all of that. But to the extent that the church is just seen as a wing of a particular partisan party, the church will continue to decline, I think, and people who see the imperfections in that particular party will feel like they're not welcome. And so in addition to making it a safe place for people to raise their questions and wrestle with doubt, I think there has to be a decoupling of the kingdom from kind of partisan politics. And that's true on both extremes. I realize that, just because I'm in Oklahoma, that's not the only part of the country, and evangelicalism is not the only branch of the church. So I would say that of all kind of branches and denominations within the church.
Yeah, yeah. And I always want, these conversations I don't ever want to like target or demonize one group, because it's never just one. It's always, we all have our role in improving and becoming
Yeah.
better. And so that's where I think that's why I think these conversations are so important. And so, I get messages on Instagram, due to some of the posts that I post and the questions I ask online through our Instagram, which is Rethinking Christianity. I'd love to hear. So I get these messages sometimes of people that are just wrestling with doubt, and they're like, I'm trying to start new. I'm trying to start fresh. And so, I think that this book could be helpful for you. I'd encourage you to go out and get it. But I'd love to hear, if you could give a last piece of just kind of a piece of advice to someone that maybe is kind of just trying to figure it out, that maybe they've grown up in church or they haven't, or wherever they're at, just wrestling with those doubts. If you could give them maybe a piece of advice or maybe a starting point for them personally that could be helpful for them.
Yeah, one of the things we haven't talked about, but it's a big part of the book, is a lot of times these conversations about faith, about doubt, about deconstruction, about apologetics, they take place in a very cerebral, rational space. Our apologetics textbooks are very much like, here's 4 arguments for God, and here's answers to the problem of evil, and it's a very sort of like cerebral, rational
Yeah.
conversation. But one of the things I've found is that we tend to enlist our reason and our rationality to back up decisions that were made from our gut and from our experience and from trauma. And so if we only dwell in this realm of reason and rational arguments, and then we're missing an important piece of the puzzle. And so one of the things I'm trying to do in the book, and it connects with this emphasis on the imagination, is to get beyond these rational arguments. And one of the ways I do that is to enlist a lot of art and literature, fiction specifically, because I think part of becoming a follower of Christ is what I would call, to use kind of like an academic term, the sanctification of our imagination. And so it's not just about pouring some more info into our cranium. We're not just brains on sticks who need, a different set of rational arguments. Our hearts and our imaginations need to be, if I could use this word, they need to be infected with kind of the ethos of the gospel. And I think that's so important, because even when you begin to question your faith and you wrestle with things, if you have this kind of heart and imagination that's been just sort of taken over by the the story of the gospel and the heart of Jesus, then that can really carry you through a lot of rational questions. And so the importance of art and literature, I talk about how that was really formative for people like C.S. Lewis, and deal with a lot of other um, sort of fiction writers as well. I think that's important. It's something that's missing in a lot of these conversations about apologetics and faith and doubt.
Yeah, yeah. I would that's a very valid point, because for me, and I kind of forget, and it's easy to get caught up and forget, like, not everyone's like you. And so
Mhm.
I'm fine with reading like just rationale and fiction or nonfiction and things like
Mhm.
that. And I've actually had to challenge myself of like, maybe I need to read some other different thought to kind of, kind of have that balance. I've recently started reading the Brothers Karamazov, and
Mhm.
that's been something that's like kind
Yeah.
of different for me, but it's really, really good book.
Mhm.
And so I think that that's a very valid point, and something that I think that also that the church, I think, could probably improve on is creating spaces for those people that need more of an imaginative kind of ways to practice their faith or wrestle through these conversations. And so I
Mhm.
think that that's a pretty valid, very valid point. I think that I remember looking and seeing you have like there is some fiction in the book. Is that correct?
Yeah, one of the things I do, and it's people might think this is really cool, or they might think it's really weird, but in addition to these nonfiction chapters, which kind of lay out my argument or my exploration, throughout the book, in between those chapters, is a fictional narrative about a young lady named Eliza Johnson who goes off to a Christian college and begins to lose her faith. And she's not a real person. It's not my college, anything like that. But it is in some ways a compilation of stories I've heard just 100 times from young people, especially as they walk that path of beginning to question their faith, feeling kind of disillusioned with a certain segment of the church, and so that fictional narrative weaves through the book. And I won't give away the ending.
Yeah.
It's not a it's not a sort of like um, God is not dead. Everybody gets saved in the end, and they all smile at the camera, freeze
Yeah.
framed or something. But it is there is hope in the end as well, and so that weaves through the book, and I hope some readers will find that to be kind of like kind of like some leaven mixed in with the dough that makes it a little bit different kind of book than they're expecting.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, cool, Josh. I really appreciate you coming on, and I'm looking forward for readers or listeners and readers to get a hold of your book, and I hope that it can be helpful for people, because I know that's your hope for it. And I really appreciate your heart, and for those people that are kind of just on the fringes and are working through their faith, because I think there needs to be more of this attitude of just being there to help people and walk with people and creating spaces and environments for people to have conversation that allows for some middle ground. And I think it's really, really useful and really helpful. And so I'd encourage you all to go check out Perhaps. Is September 21st. Is that the correct?
Yeah, I think that's the release date,
Okay, cool.
September 21st. And yeah, thanks for having me, Blake.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll have a link to your blog and our listen notes, and a link to the book. And I'm super looking forward for people to getting a hold of it. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.